As it says here on the screen, my name is Kevin Kline. I'm a principal program manager at SentryOne. Many of you may not have heard of us. We are a tools vendor, and we do have a booth downstairs. And just to tell you a little bit about the company, just very, very quickly, we make tools that do monitoring, optimization, tuning, as well as building and testing and documenting for the Microsoft Data Platform. Our real pride is that we are very, very passionate about SQL Server. So a lot of companies make products for whoever will buy products, right? But we are former SQL Server DBAs, by and large, at my company, and so we really care a lot about SQL Server. And our products are typically going to be the highest performing, the broadest of collecting, the deepest of analysis on your workloads, and we really, really care about that sort of stuff. Also, the other thing that's really unique about our company, we're kind of new in the EU, but we've been in the US and the British Isles for quite a while. And what's really different, I think, from me, I had been 10 years at a competitor and had started their tools unit for SQL Server. It's in this lower right corner. We are in the top 1% of not just monitoring tools company. We're in the top 1% of software manufacturers in terms of our customer service ratings. We really, really care a lot that you get a good experience. And so that's just what we do. We're very serious about it. If you have ever used Amazon, for example, and bought a product based on the reviews, the first little learning suggestion of the day from me is to take a look at this website called TrustRadius. And what TrustRadius is it is real users giving reviews of enterprise software. So let's say you work at a logistics management company and you have trucks driving around and loading and unloading cargo. There's going to be a lot of different products up there that are reviewed in terms of how good they are. And maybe doctor office management, monitoring tools, etc. Our score has gone up to 9.2 on TrustRadius, which is pretty much about as high as it goes for anybody. And our next closest competitor is in the high sixes or low sevens, depending on when you might take a look at them. So quality is our byword. Now, the other thing that I do just want to mention is we have a product up here called Plan Explorer, and it is so free that we don't even ask for an email address. So you won't get spammed or called or harassed by salespeople, but it is incredibly popular. It is used, right now our reckoning is about 2.1 million users of the product. And it is, to query tuning, what Visual Studio is to writing C# code, right? It does for query tuning what we always wanted Management Studio to do. It's really wonderful. If you have some time tomorrow, I'll show you a demo. There's lots of videos that show you how to use it as well, so you can learn it offline. The other reason this slide is worth mentioning is I'm going to show you a couple of our tools as we go along, not with the intent to sell you on the product, but because I'm actually going to offer you, if you would like, some of these products for long-term use, okay, at no cost. So that is another opportunity as well. Now, if you are a reader, and I hope you are, because today we live life with a version number, right? I started using SQL Server, I've been 6 years as an Oracle developer, working for NASA, and had a great time doing that. Started to work on SQL Server back before it was a Windows product, because they had not invented Windows at the time. So I've been using it for a long time, and you have to keep up, right? There's always new stuff to learn. And so I'd point your attention to SQLperformance.com. If you are the sort of person who cares a lot about performance, there's amazing articles there about multiple ways you can solve a problem in SQL Server and which one performs best. So we do all kinds of empirical testing to show which different technique might perform better one from the other. The other one is that century1.com/resources. Lots of query tuning videos there. We have lots of ebooks, white papers, and things like that. Again, they're just technical education for the SQL Server professional. It's not trying to sell you on anything. All right. Now, just in case you've never heard of me, my name, again, is Kevin Kline, and some of you might know me as one of the original founders of PASS, of which PASS Deutschland is the event organizer here for this event. I was president for 4 years in the early 2000s when the organization was getting started. And I've written many books as well over the years, things like SQL in a Nutshell, some other books like that. So, and you can tell I'm already off to a great start with my animations in the wrong order, right? Yeah, super. So what are we going to talk about today? Basically, we're going to talk about a few steps involved with the work that needs to be done before we actually make a full and major move into the cloud. What steps do we need to take for this to be a successful or mostly successful transition? So the 5 things we're going to talk about, actually there's one more that's not on the list. I'm going to give you some general thoughts in just a moment that precedes these 5 things. So cleansing your data and your code before you make a move. This is a very, very important part of the process. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about building a good set of documentation for your system. And again, this is very, very important. It's the kind of thing that is encumbering and difficult at the time you do it, but if you don't do it and you need it later on, it's not just an annoyance. It's heartbreakingly difficult. We're going to talk about some of the different tools and techniques you can use to make a move to the cloud. We're going to talk a little bit about how to test your data to make sure that your move has been successful. And then we are going to wrap up with talking about, once we have done that move, how do we do the transition from the old primary system, if one exists, to the new primary system that runs that application now in the cloud. Okay? All right. So a few starter thoughts about the cloud. And one of the first things that people ask, if we're having a cup of coffee together, one of the first things they ask is, how for real is the cloud? Is this a big deal yet? Is it going to be a big deal soon? And the answer to that is it's actually already surprisingly real. Okay? So when I'm at an event like this, a lot of people say, if you're chatting in the hall, they're like, I don't know anyone who's using Azure or AWS or the Google Cloud or another hosting provider. But in polls and analysis of the consumer base, large enterprises and organizations hosting their different applications, what we're finding is about 40% of data today is actually resident in the cloud. Okay? And I'm talking about database data. I'm not talking about MP3 files and your favorite YouTube videos. I'm talking about real transactional databases. About 40% of them are out there in the cloud, which, I think for many of us is a little bit surprising. And we're also finding that about 2/3 of those who are either in the cloud or making plans to go to the cloud soon, about 2/3 of those are planning a hybrid deployment. What does that mean, hybrid deployment? Well, it means you still have one foot on premises in some way or another. For example, a lot of companies might have their authentication and security founded on Active Directory internally, and then you can connect out to the cloud for certain resources out there. That might be one example of it. So here's a bit of personal, this is my own opinion. It's not endorsed certainly by Microsoft or Google, but one of the things you'll hear many of the cloud vendors tell you about is one of the main reasons you should go to the cloud is you're going to save money. Not true in my experience. The best outcome that I have seen in moving to the cloud is for those who have teams or organizations that are managing their budget closely and they need to get a lot of dollars or euros off of CapEx, capital expenditures, and we need to get those over onto operational expenditures, right? We need to move where these dollars hit or these euros hit on the balance sheet. That's the big advantage. What we find management is also thinking about, I use the word reducing headcount, but that's actually inaccurate. What we want to be able to do as managers, and I've managed very large teams at different times in the past, what we want is to get the most value for our talent's time. We want them to be able to produce great results for us. And so if you as a manager were looking at the activities of your team, and you had one person that was full-time doing backups and restore, and they were applying patches, and they were applying upgrades, how much does that actually advance the interests of the corporation or the firm that you're at? That really doesn't deliver a lot of extra value. That's kind of table stakes, right? The money you would pay to just get into a good game of poker or something like that. That's just to keep an even keel. What we really want is for all of our staff to add value. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in just a moment. So it can help us reapportion our headcount and devote our resources of staff to things that actually make our business better in the marketplace. And that's a really powerful proposition. Another thing that will come up again and again through the next couple slides is kind of underlying some of the points that I'm making, is that what is a well-coded application for an on-premises product that one of your teams has built is going to be very, very different in the cloud. Because when we're in the cloud, we pay for consumption. Generally, we don't have to pay for ingress of data going in. In some circumstances, we do. But we have to pay for the egress, the data moving out of the data center to our desktops. We have to pay for CPU. We have to pay for IOPS. We have to pay for storage. And so the big difference is, with our coding standards, is it's very common for developers to be 9 meters away from the server on a high-speed network backbone. And we don't care what the latency is across the wire, right? And we don't care if we type select star, because we've got this whole, intertube to ourselves. But when we move to the cloud, you pay for every bit of that. Every time you write a select star, instead of asking just for the 3 columns out of 12 that you need, you have to pay for all of that extra data. So that's a very important kind of underlying kind of theme about many of the other points as we go along. Now, another thing I will do, which an official Microsoft employee would not do, is I will tell you the use cases in which it's probably not a good idea to go to the cloud. If you talk to Amazon employees, you talk to Microsoft cloud folks, they'll tell you everything is going to run great in the cloud. It's going to solve all our problems. It's going to cure cancer. It's going to make you look better. It's going to clear up my teenage daughter's acne. I mean, it's going to fix every problem. I have 6 daughters, by the way, so take pity. So 4 cases where you don't want to go to the cloud, at least today. If you were telling me about the different apps that you were building and you, or had built and you're considering moving to the cloud, let's say you had one particular legacy application that's been around for a long time, and it connects to some AS400 stuff in the enterprise, and it connects to a Sybase database over here for certain kinds of data, and then it does all this work on an older version of SQL Server because the vendor who built that portion of the application is no longer in business and doing updates on it. And, when we see a legacy situation that is tangled up with all kinds of other applications, I would not move that to the cloud. It's kind of the same reason we do see vendors who, end users, enterprises, who have a product that's been running for 15 years. It does exactly what we want it to. It's not broken, but we also haven't updated a darn thing on that server. It's because the vendor hasn't advanced it, and it works. So we're just going to leave it. This is a situation where it's very difficult to untangle all of those knots. So unless you're prepared to make a huge investment in making those twisted and knotted up lines of connectivity between these different elements of your infrastructure, it's better not to do that. It just takes so much work. Another one, as I mentioned before, is this cloud sticker shock. One thing I've seen talking to many people who have deployed an initial pilot project to the cloud is they actually not only did not save money, but it cost a lot more money than they ever expected it to. And you do hear plenty of stories in which, well, they have a particular application that you can even spin up and spin down VMs according to how much work is being done. And so you do hear pretty frequently about different apps and app designers didn't realize that they could spin down 2 or 3 of the 6 servers at night when there's less transaction load and saved a lot of money. Those things are, just unexpected differences in operations. So, I chalk that one up to a learning experience. What I'm actually talking about here is not a learning experience. I'm talking about it was just impossible to tell how much this was going to cost when we had to use Azure DTUs, or we had to use, some kind of measurement from Amazon. What we have when we buy a server, let's say we spent 10,000 euros on this nice server, and that we only hit 30% of the CPU, and then we move that into the cloud, any kind of sloppiness or laziness on the part of our developers or stored procedure writers and so forth, we didn't have to pay extra for that. We paid a big chunk of money for the server, and it covered everything we needed. But when you move to the cloud, every cycle, every IOP, all those things, the little counter for how much you spend is spinning. And so you'll see that sticker shock happen a lot. Security is another really, really big issue in the cloud. And it's a little bit different in the USA than here in the EU, since you have GDPR. And does anyone know what the fine is for a GDPR violation? 20 million or 4% of your revenue. Right? So if you're BP, British Petroleum, 4% of your revenue could be even more than $20 billion, right? It could be a lot of money. Wow, that really has teeth, right? We don't have a law in the USA that is universal across all 50 states and has that kind of teeth to it, right? That kind of really, really stiff backbone. So I would say security is even more important here throughout the EU than it is in the USA. And I still made this recommendation for a US audience. So definitely it's something that if you have any personally identifiable information or different things like that, pay a lot of attention to your security requirements. You might need what we call an air gap, right? You need to actually have separation, no connectivity between the internet and your application. So if that's the case, don't put it to the cloud. And then finally, speed. Analytics, personalization, we have recommendation engines, we have IoT. A lot of those need really, really high throughput. And there's a certain amount of latency that's built into using the internet that you just can't get around. So I have seen situations in which people were planning their organization's deployment to the cloud, and when they realized how much they would undershoot the performance goals that they needed to achieve, they're like, I can't do this. You have to do it in-house. Now, has anyone heard of the term edge computing? You can just nod. Thank you. I know not to do this with German audiences because normally you're like, I don't want to answer you. But thank you for that. If you haven't heard of this term, it's an interesting term. Think of the cloud, right? And we think of a browser connecting to our services somewhere in the cloud. With edge computing, what that does is that pushes a lot of the calculations and work to the terminal at the edge of the cloud. Okay? This is kind of a new concept. It's maybe no more than 2 years old, and haven't heard a lot about it until within the last year. And so there are paradigms, there are coding standards around how to take advantage of edge computing if you have really high-end performance needs and you insist on using the cloud. But right now, I don't recommend that for most of us in most situations. Now, assuming this is the case, and we're able to move things, none of the caveats are kicking in here, or warnings are going off. We're going to go ahead and move to the cloud for at least one of our applications. What do you do with all your free time that this promised land delivers to us? So this is something I've been evangelizing for a long, long time. If you've never heard of this, this is really, really a good something for you to study, particularly if you have some ambitions in your career and you want to move up the ladder of responsibility and leadership. There are these proven maturity models that demonstrate the characteristics of organizations that are really, really successful at running IT within their company, and to the point that they outperform their competitors, okay? So a lot of places just say, okay, IT is a fixed cost, I have to have it. But there are some companies that say, oh, if we do IT really well, we can actually do better than those we're competing against. And that is those companies that implement the capabilities maturity model. And so what most organizations are actually operating at is either over here at level 1. For example, you don't know when you have a problem until your users start calling you to complain. And that's actually the way I ran my DBA shop for a couple of years before I started to wise up and get proactive. And then when we get to level 1, one of the interesting things that the documentation tells us is that at this level 1, things get fixed, but only through the heroic efforts of individual employees. Has anyone here ever been called in at 1 a.m. To fix something? That's because your organization was at level 1. And so then you want to get to the next level. If you're able to now stop spending so much time worrying about patching, and so much time worrying about the next version or your backups and recovery, then you can do things like looking at your performance thresholds and set a threshold that if it ever drops below, it warns you rather than users calling you to complain, and they're already angry and they're already blaming your team, right? So now you set a threshold, you know when it happens before they do, you fix it before anyone ever notices there was a problem, right? So I've kind of spent my life trying to get better and better at this as I've led DBA teams over the years, and commensurately we built these kinds of thought processes into our tools at SentryOne. So that's something to study after you've gotten your feet wet with the cloud. To get to the cloud, though, assuming we passed those earlier caveats and warnings, now the next thing you want to do is you want to clean your data. There's a couple reasons that we are going to clean data. For example, back in the US, I had one client, very large law firm, and they decided they wanted to do some things in the cloud, and they were just going to move their entire multi-terabyte database into the cloud. Well, it turns out that quite a lot of the data that they had in their database, they hadn't done a single search on about 60% of that data in years. Years that data has not been used for any purpose. They didn't use it for decision making, they didn't use it for planning, they didn't use it to look up legal precedents or anything like that. It wasn't junky data, it wasn't bad, it was just data that they did not access anymore. And so we talked about it. It's like, well, how about if we put that into an archival database on premises? You can look it up if you want to, you just don't need to. They're like, yeah, that would work. So what we're able to do is only put about 40% of that 2 terabytes up into their new database, and that saved them all of that storage, all of that ingress and egress of data, and those kinds of costs were saved. The other reason I encourage you to do this is it's just important to know what your data is about. And you want to make sure, for example, junk data. Does anyone have maybe a CRM, a sales database, and it lists a company as Hewlett-Packard and HP and HPE, because after a while they split printers from the enterprise stuff, right? And so you have 4 different customers, they're all the same customer. That's the junky data that you want to clean up. And that falls under even a broader kind of term called data governance, right? We want to have a kind of central authoritative set of data. And you don't have to do it here, but this is a really, really good checkpoint to go through and make sure that your data is set up in a way that it is bringing value to the organization, because you have to pay for all of that you put into the cloud. So it just makes sense to go ahead and stop, take a look at it, see what makes sense, push to the side anything that isn't sensible, and only go forward with that which is really going to actually move the application forward. Now, just as a quick side note, you heard me mention that you have to pay for data egress, data coming out. In general, with Amazon and with Microsoft, you don't have to pay for data ingress, with a couple exceptions, which is actually true of probably everything I'm going to say today, right? Oh yeah, that's true, except for these 2 edge cases here, right? So one example of that is if you're using gateway services. You do have to pay for ingress and egress of data there. So there are some exceptions to the rule. But for databases, it's the ingress. I'm sorry, it's the bringing out of data outside of your data center. That's an important thing to note. I'll talk about that a little bit more detail. Okay? So another aspect of cleaning things up before you go to the cloud, I would also go as far as to say this would be a good time to do a code review as well. Again, why look at our code? I already mentioned one thing. Select star, right? Have a lot of folks writing queries that say select star on a table that has 20 columns, but it only needs 6 of them. That's a lot more data that's going to be coming down every time that particular command is invoked. And so it's a situation in which our developers had been writing the app to go to a server that's just 9 meters away over there, and now we've moved it 9 kilometers to the Amazon data center up the road. We have to pay for all of that. So it's good to go through and take a look at all of these different kind of worst practices for coding and do a quick assessment on that. Now, 2 things I want to mention to you. One thing that's great about the SQL Server community is how much sharing there is with different kinds of code. So the first thing I would encourage you to take a look at is there is some code called the best practices, let's see, what is it called? The best practices toolkit. So a person named Pedro Lopez, who's on the Microsoft product management team, he's written a batch of code, a really big batch of T-SQL code that you can get off of GitHub, and it will look through your databases, and it will tell you if you're breaching any one of several dozen different worst practices, okay? Now, a lot of them are server-oriented things, like maybe you don't have error alerting turned on. That's, kind of server-oriented rather than coding-oriented. But there are lots of code-oriented best practices that it will check for. So if nothing else, run that free stuff, right? To see what might be a little bit less than optimal there. Then we have a product called BI Express, and it has over 200 best practices that it will look for in your code and let you know if it has any violations of those best practices as well. Okay? So let's see here. Looks like it was not advancing properly. All right. Now, another thing that you also want to do, as I mentioned here, is test. And I say test far before your migration. Why does the timing of that, this is strange. It's changing here, but it's not changing up here. All right, let's see here. So the point I was making before, and I apologize that none of these previous bullet points came up. Test far before you do migration. What does far before mean? Well, I'm talking about like a couple months before, 3 or 4 months before you actually go to the cloud. Test it. Why is that? There's a real common thing that happens to DBAs who are trying to clean up their databases, and they're like, oh, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to see if I have any duplicate indexes in my databases and get rid of those because duplicate indexes can impede good performance. So another thing they'll do is then they'll take a look at all the indexes in their database and they'll say, you know what? This particular index hasn't been used for 6 weeks. I don't need that. I'll throw it away. But it turns out that particular index is used at end of quarter processing, right? So at the end of the 3-month period, it's excruciatingly important. But for a lot of the month, or any given month, unless it's the end month of the quarter, it's not terribly important. So that's one of the things that I'm getting to when I say test far before you do your migration as to your code, because your code may be used frequently, but the frequency of its use is a little bit beyond the testing frame of 1 or 2 weeks. So take that into account when you do that so that you can make sure you're actually aware of how important that code might be at a different cycle than what you were initially thinking, okay? All right. Now, as I'd mentioned in passing before, I just want to mention it again, too. If you are crossing data centers with your data, it costs more money, both with Amazon and with Microsoft. So I don't know the full arrangement of Azure data centers in Germany, but let's say there's east and west data centers, or north-south, east, and west. If I've seen people design systems with intentional redundancy, so we have application both in the database both in the east and the west, and if there's ever a failure, we'll roll over to the other region. However, they didn't write the code in such a way that it was aware of what data center it was working from, and they were doing cross-data center queries. You will have to pay extra for that. So take a note of that if you haven't actually encountered that design situation. Make sure that you're doing your work all within one data center, and it will greatly reduce your costs. Okay? All right. So I'm going to press the advanced button here, and I'm going to pray that it works. Whew. Okay, good. All right. So documenting data sources and metadata. Now, when I was coming up in my early days, when I was working at NASA, we had a relational database that ran on a $2.5 million mainframe, which literally did less work than one of these today, right? Is anyone in the same boat as me? You've got some gray hairs. You remember those days? All right, a couple of us have, yeah. Thank you for representing for your peeps, right? So yeah, you know, and because it was so expensive, we spent a large amount of time documenting and building out all of our metadata about our systems because they were so important and so expensive that it was actually cheaper for us to go and write our programs by hand with paper and then come back later and key them in than it was to, you know, try a program and get it wrong multiple times directly on the terminal. Everything old is new again. And so in this case, we really have a repeat of the mainframe with the cloud, except instead of the mainframe and our dumb terminals, now we have the cloud and our internet connecting us to our browsers. It's just like that. And so one of the things that's extremely important is to document your data sources, because now that we can build things quickly and easily in the cloud, if we don't have documentation to tell us the end-to-end picture of that application, we invariably get tied up into knots because we lose track of the Power BI reports that we have in one business unit of the company while another business unit has a bunch of stuff in reporting services, and yet another group does straight SQL queries that uses a SQL agent job to email to the different managers of their team. All of that stuff gets tangled up if you don't keep track of it. So it's really important for you to take some time and build your data dictionaries that includes as much data or metadata as you can, as much details about everything involved in the particular project if you are migrating it to the cloud. A lot of senior people that I've talked to over the years who have been able to go to a startup, when you ask them, what was the most appealing thing about the startup? And they said, many of them said, I get to like wipe the slate clean and start over from scratch. I don't have to carry years of technical debt forward with me into this new system. I get to build it all from scratch and not have, you know, these tangled webs of different contributing parts in this application. I get to build it right from the ground up. And that's kind of exciting too. Now, one of the things that gets really hard in SQL Server, and you know, it's kind of cool, it's one of the benefits of using the Microsoft Data Platform, is that it has a philosophy of everything in the box, right? So when you buy SQL Server, you get licenses not only to the relational engine, but you get them to analysis services and integration services and reporting services, and so on and so forth. So you need to be aware of, you know, the different kinds of jobs that are producing output or ingesting input to your SQL Server, whether that be through SSIS or SQL agent or some other mechanism. And also, you know, what are the frequency? What is the rate at which these changes occur over time? Data is moved in or out. Maybe it has to move all at one time. When these jobs kick off. So you need to know that information as well. Now, another example I'd like to give you is around this concept of data lineage, okay? And I've thrown out an example, but it was a real-world example of something I had experienced with a retail customer where they had a lot of AS400s that they still kept around for some reason. I don't really know why. And they produced a lot of output on flat files. And then they had a SQL agent job that would grab those flat files on a regular basis and move it to a centralized kind of file server. Then they had SSIS jobs on that file server that would munge all the data and transform it. And then from there it was moved over into a production SQL server. And then the production SQL server later spun that data off into analysis services queue. You know, there's multiple step after step after step. And I joked with this customer because they called this their Jello application. I was like, what's a Jello application? And they said, well, if we push our Jello application on this side and it wobbles a little bit, by the time it gets over to this side, it's shaking back and forth like it's a giant mound of Jello, you know, so it's just wobbling all over the place and gonna fall over. And we talked about doing a documentation phase, and they actually brought in some consultants to do this work for them. But it was quite a load of work for them to get to where they actually fully understood everything it touched. So there's a couple free solutions that will help you do this documentation phase. The first one is the Map Toolkit. Anyone heard of that, Map Toolkit? A couple of us? Right on, okay. So that's the Microsoft Assessment and Planning Toolkit. And it is kept up to date, and it's free, but it does require some Microsoft Office licenses. Is that a problem for anyone here? Okay. So it produces its output in Word and Excel formats and things like that. And it tells you what's installed on all your servers, and if you have maybe IIS installed alongside SQL Server, it'll point out all those kind of things. It doesn't go super deep into the schema. There's another free product written by a Microsoft PFE back in the US named Kendall Van Dyke, and he's released onto GitHub something called SQL Power Doc. And it's a PowerShell library, and with both of these, by the way, if you run them on a system in-house, please tell your network team before you do that, because it produces a lot of network traffic, and I have had people tell me, well, you know, all of the network team ran to my office thinking that I was launching a virus attack on the entire infrastructure of the system. So just make sure you go about this the right way. But SQL PowerDoc not only gives you a full description of everything on your servers, it also goes into the tables. It describes all the different objects like functions and stored procedures and things like that. The alternative I want to show you is something called, it's one of our products, and it's called, let's see here, if I can start my little video. And I apologize that I don't actually have a full working copy of this set up at the moment. But this is our Doc Express product. It goes on, it'll work on SQL Server, analysis services, integration services. It'll work on Informatica or Oracle. And you can extract the data from it in a number of different ways. I think the majority of people who use it probably will use the take a snapshot option, okay? Now, what it does when you take a snapshot is it catalogs everything that's out there. It tells you all about SQL Server, integration services, analysis services, and it is aware of the connections. So it will build for you this map of your entire architecture of the system, including handing off to even other systems like Oracle, and maybe you've got Hyperion Essbase for Oracle. So it will hand that off. It'll show you all the dependencies all the way through. If you were to click on one of the, these particular packages or one of those different elements, you'll see on the right-hand side it gives you the nav tree. You can see everything that it touches, and you can go deeper levels. You can then drill down to a particular table, or you can drill down to from an SSIS package to the specific elements of that, the specific steps within that. And and you can, pull the map around and make it prettier or less pretty, depending on how you like things here. It looks like it stopped on the little demo. Now, the reason I'm showing this to you is if you are interested in this, I will give you what we call our proof of concept license. So that means you can use it free of charge for a year, and if you like it, at the end of the year, you can simply pay the annual maintenance fee at that point. So you don't even have to pay for the full license. I'll give that to you. And so you can see we drill down and we've asked for more information about this. That'll be enough time for you to actually use this on one of your systems and see whether you like this product or not, to prove the concept of whether you want to build data dictionaries and so forth in your enterprise. Now, from here, you can also do a little bit of additional work. So here we're looking at the data lineage of this particular column all the way through a couple different applications in use. But if you wanted to, you can also click the Doc Express button up there on the toolbar, if I can point that out. And this is the part that will show you the data dictionary that it builds. And so when you build the data dictionary, again, I was going to say I think it's stopped here. Let me move a little further down to this little demo. When you open up the data dictionary, you can see a variety, you can see it in a variety of different ways. It will go through all of your data. It will make some best guesses on different aspects of the data. For example, it will flag certain fields as GDPR under the purview of GDPR. You can also have your different users add additional information if there's SLAs or things like that. You can save that. You can do some team kind of delegation so that they can all together build out this data dictionary. And it will also, like I said, it will tell you from one end to the other end of multiple applications where this particular column gets used. And for me, that was something I used to write. I would say it was not the best code in the world, but I was a pretty good Transact SQL programmer. And to suss out how many levels of dependency I had to iteratively go through, I didn't know that answer before I started. So if I went only 4 levels deep, I wouldn't know if it was actually deep enough or not. So what this will give you at the end is a file that has that full data dictionary, and you can put it out in a PDF file, you can put it out in an HTML file, you can put it out into a CHM file, which is like an application that you downloaded. It's got a help file. You can get all that. So that's going to help you enormously. What's it going to do? Help enormously is very vague. What this is going to do is a month from now, when you've got to troubleshoot stuff, you will have pointers to everything that it might impact, right? That's where it really becomes valuable. When you're doing maintenance, when you're doing fixes, when you're doing troubleshooting, and when you're upgrading the system and you're adding to it. It is incredibly valuable at that stage. So let's say we've taken a look at all the code. We figured out that we want to, it's going to be lifted up to the cloud. We're going to move that data. Now we need to take a look and ascertain certain characteristics of that data. We want to know how much downtime, for example, we can sustain. And based on that question, that has a very direct bearing on how we are going to move data to the cloud. So one example is if you have a multi-terabyte database and you're going to push that data through your wire up to the service provider, over to the data center, depending on how big your pipe is, that could take days or more, right? So Microsoft actually has, and Amazon actually has a service where you can put a database onto a bunch of multi-terabyte disks, right? Sneaker net it over to them, and they'll put it in the data center and load that up, and you don't have to spend days waiting for it to get made available for you, nor do you have to pay those fees for moving all that data around. If your database is small, you can use some of these other methods of moving data around. You can use backup and restore, Azure Data Factory or SSIS. You can use PowerShell scripts. Now, one thing to note, at least with Azure, there's Azure SQL databases, then there's SQL Server running in VMs, and then there's something else called Azure Managed Instances. You can't use the backup and restore feature to get an on-premises database into a cloud Azure SQL database. It doesn't work that way. But you can do that with an Azure Managed Instance. So if you need that particular set of features, and you plan over time that, well, we'll take another backup a month in after we've run all our trials and then move all that, we'll do a restore to the cloud, go with Azure Managed Instances. And if you have multiple instances as well, it's a more cost-effective way of doing things, okay? If you don't want to have downtime, you have to do this really difficult thing of running systems in parallel. Has anyone ever done that before? Did you enjoy it? Probably not. It's really, really tough to do this. But there's a couple things you can do. You could use replication, for example, or you could use service broker and broker queues. So one thing that we do see a lot of customers using is what they'll do is they'll create a queuing system for the on-premises server, and it's very, very easy to create additional endpoints of the same queue. And so now you have these two queues, same source, one writing to on-premises, one writing to the cloud. And you can stay perfectly in sync that way. You're not using replication, which is really brittle and can break really easily. So you're using queuing to keep them in sync. Then when the glorious day arrives and you can turn one off and promote the other to production, it's very simple and easy, okay? Now, talking about tools when we do the cutover, there's a few quick elements to think about there as well, which I want to remind you of, which is always test. Just always test. Data is the most important asset that an IT organization has. It's not the computers. It's not the big money we spent on that all-flash SAN array. It's the data, right? That's the real asset there. So always test this stuff. But another thing that we do see happen a lot is there are certain things about particularly Azure SQL database that are not quite an apples-to-apples comparison with a regular on-premises database. For example, certain extended properties, there's a little bit of syntax still that's not quite the same as on-premises. SQL CLR is not fully supported in the cloud. Actually, they turned it on for like a short period of time, and then they're like, that's a mistake. So people at Microsoft turned it back off. So it's not quite apples to apples there. And so you need to be aware of that with your apps as you move them up to the cloud. Another thing that's kind of interesting, that's the flip side of that, I mentioned a couple dangers. One of the flip sides when you are moving that data is that one of the things Microsoft did a few years ago that has pushed them into the upper right quadrant of the Gartner Magic Quadrant for operational databases is they went to this cloud-first strategy with their data platform, okay, with SQL Server. So that means that they have, for the last several years, when Gartner looked at what they were doing, they're like, A, you develop new features faster than any other database vendor out there. Oracle can't get close to this. SAP, HANA cannot get close to this. MySQL can't get close. But what they do is they're able to turn on features without even telling us for A/B testing. So they'll turn on a new small optimizer feature and see if people who have similar workloads are performing better or worse. If you've ever been to an optometrist and they put that glass thing over your eyes and they say, better, worse, better, worse. Microsoft is doing that around the clock with all these features. And they always come out on the cloud before they come out for our on-premises versions of SQL Server. It's just something to be aware of. Another really interesting benefit that Microsoft has been able to see from this is that for a long time, they would spend a lot of time and energy producing a new feature and never know whether it was a popular feature or not. Now they can know that within a week, right? Oh, this is a win. This is a goal. So now another thing, and again, as I mentioned, I've assisted a lot of customers and advised a lot of customers doing this kind of work. When you move to the cloud, one of the key things that I've encouraged you to do up to this point is to test. What does that mean? So once you get your data up into the cloud, you get your apps translated as much as they need to be, you could, whoops, let me go back. You could run these unit tests. If your team was really good when they were writing the application, they might be able to reuse old unit tests that they have, maybe Team Foundation Services or something like that. But again, this is another thing I want to point out to you, is that we have this product that actually does some really cool, it's the only product I'm aware of that does anything like this. It's a very simple interface. This product is called Legitest. And what it does is when you are working with data, you could say, I've got the version that I pulled off of Oracle, and I've got the version of the product that I have up in the cloud. Now I want to make sure that my procs are producing the same output. Now I want to make sure that the totals for these 40 tables, and if I do aggregates on the different numeric columns in these tables, I want to make sure they add up to the same thing. And so this particular application makes it easy for you to, we have these things called recipes, and so you can tell Legitest as it's going along, I want you to look at this particular database, I want you to compare it to this other database, these particular parts of that database, and it will give you a report, assuming this video will work. And again, I'm extending to you the same offer as I did with the Doc Express. If you were interested in having a tool that can tell you what's on premises compared to what is in the cloud is the same or not, it will give you that information very quickly. You notice it's got the data consistency. It says, yes, check, green, we're good. We have down here, we have some X's in red that are telling us we have some issues there. And you can use this to also synchronize your data and do a number of other activities like that. So it's a very neat product, a very neat set of capabilities that will help you do that one really, really hard part that either we had to wrangle the developers into either finding their old unit tests or building new ones, or it is something that DBAs have to do, and every DBA I've ever talked to has never had the time for this kind of stuff. So this makes all of that hard work very, very quick and very, very easy. We call it build a data fidelity test in 1 minute, and it works. It's really neat stuff. All right. So again, I just wanted to extend that offer to you if you want to, if you were interested in doing some of that kind of work. All right, got to move on. Sorry about that. So we've got our test system, our pilot project up in the cloud. We've got our on-premises project. It's possible that we may have been able to switch one off and the other one on, and that worked out okay. But most of us usually have to do the parallel kind of deployment, where we have one running and the other running at the same time. And again, having that data testing tool there is great, because you can take checkpoints along the way and make sure they're both giving you the same results. And that's a very reassuring indicator that the parallel process is going to switch over to the full cloud process quickly. But when we're maintaining these systems, on the ETL side, moving that data around, you can use ADF, which is the Azure Data Factory. That's the Azure version of SSIS. And SSIS is the on-prem version of ADF. You can use those to move your data back and forth. You can build it into the application. So you can do it from a kind of an administrator standpoint, that's the top bullet, or you can do it from the app dev standpoint of moving that data around. And it's at that point that you might find that your developers have the skill to use this kind of eventual consistency concept where we have multiple queues. They start in the same place, but their endpoints are the on-prem and the cloud database system, and so you can make sure that they get all the same amount of data as they move along. Now, the last step before you go to the full transition, well, as I mentioned, your documentation is probably out of date by the time you get to this point, so it's a living document. You'd want to update all your documentation as much as you can. And then, again, you've got to test things. Testing gives us confidence, right? And there was nothing I liked less than going into my CIO's office without already knowing the answers to the questions that he or she would be asking me, right? I would be sweating bullets if I had no idea why I was called in there, right? That was never a fun experience. Not that it happened a lot. I don't want you to get that impression. But if I knew what they were going to be asking about, and I had already prepared some input for them, or had a spreadsheet or two for them, that felt good. In fact, I was looking forward to them asking me these questions, because it feels really good when you know you're going to get an A on the test, right? So that's what this last step is about. You document everything so you get an A on the part of the test that relates to maintaining the system after it goes live, and you have all the tests of the data that's being moved from on-premises or into the cloud. You have all the tests that show that everything is in sync and you're confident that this is ready to go. And this also is a kind of an empowering situation to be in as a data professional. Okay. So how do I summarize here? I've got these 5 steps. If you want the slide deck, I'd be happy to share that with you. So if you want to study that in a little bit more detail, in the slide notes, I have resources that you can read more about, another level or two down on the particular steps that I go through in the slide. But the cloud is definitely coming. I was talking to a friend who actually has a role on the Azure team, and they're saying it's amazing how much work they're getting these days. And I'm like, well, I'm not easy to amaze. What are we talking about here? And they're like, no, seriously, it's amazing. And so I'm not allowed to break any NDAs, but what I will tell you is if you read Microsoft's quarterly earning reports, you'll see that the amount of money that they are making on this kind of cloud work, I'm not talking about like again, you know, pictures of your cat. Although I love your cat, and I know those pictures are worth storing up there on OneDrive, I'm talking about applications, you know, not just file storage. You'll see that, you know, they're making 1 billion more than they did last quarter, every quarter. So this is a rocket ship that's going up, and you will be asked to do this very soon if you haven't been asked to do it now, okay? It's a lot like the old days, you know, where we had to be really conscious of everything that we did. We've had a long run where we don't really have to be very, very careful because we overbuy our hardware. You know, and if things don't perform well, one of the things that friends who run IT shops would tell me is they're like, I just buy a new server every 4 years just so I get that much more extra performance, and I, you know, turn the old one over to, you know, to be a file server or something like that. If you move to the cloud, that doesn't work anymore. You don't have lots of headroom that doesn't cost you anything. All the headroom of you moving up in your performance requirement, every bit of that costs more, okay? So it's kind of like the old days in the mainframes when they were so expensive. Everything you have to pay, everything you do over what you've already done in the cloud costs more money. And then I guess the other key takeaway I would encourage you to remember is that planning is essential, and testing throughout each element, each step of the plan is your confidence builder that will enable you to go forward knowing that this is going to work, and knowing that because you have done this right, you are saving days, if not weeks or months, further down the road for bug fixes, for support, for maintenance, and for upgrades and additions to your app that you have deployed to the cloud. So with that, I'm a little bit over on the time. I apologize for that. And I'm between you and beer. I know that. But if you want, I'm available for questions. I'll be happy to answer any questions you want. I'd be thrilled if you wanted to connect online. I'm very active on Twitter. I'm very active on LinkedIn. You can connect with me on Facebook as well at K.E. Kline, but you'll see pictures of my 1 son and 7 daughters and my grandson and my dog and all that stuff. So I can tell you're not the kind of people who like that. Just kidding. So I mentioned that. Also, downstairs, we're sharing our booth with Sarpedon Labs. So if you are interested in speaking only in German, we have people who can help you with that. It's not me, but... and then finally, if you've never used this one product, I do want to call out this one product here, Plan Explorer. Has anyone used Plan Explorer here? Okay, thank you. You make my heart swell with pride. Plan Explorer has over 2 million users. It's so free, we don't even ask for an email address, okay? And what it does is it makes query tuning really, really easy. Much, much easier than what you get with Management Studio. So that's one thing I'd encourage everyone to get. But, as I mentioned, I've extended a special offer to you. If you are interested in either of those products, and I can really only provide one of those to you, come see me at the booth, and I'll get you set up, get you that full year license. If you like it, you can keep it. Well, in fact, even if you like it and don't want to pay, you can still keep it. You just won't be entitled to upgrades or to call support, right? But if you do like it and you want to buy it, you don't have to pay the full fee. It's at a discount. It's only at the ASM, the annual software maintenance fee, to continue to keep that license and keep it up to date. So I hope you'll take advantage of that. What kind of questions can I answer for you before we break for the afternoon and the evening? All right, everyone. Thank you so much. I'll hang around up here if you have any additional questions. I'll be happy to chat with you and see if I can help you with additional questions. But with that, hope to see you tonight at the Mixer, and as well tomorrow at the event, and hope it's a great event for you. Thank you very much.